Hello, everybody. It's really great to be here. And the place where I would like to start is at a breakfast television show, which brought up this question. The question of how to coexist with technology in the street, and in many ways, I think, demonstrated the problem of its impossibility. So this episode took place in November 2021 on the television show Good Morning Britain. And it featured a group interview with George Monbiot, the environmental activist, and Dawn Neeson, a journalist. During this interview, Monbiot at one point burst into tears. The topic of discussion was the protest action by the environmental group Insulate Britain, which earlier that year had blocked the ring road, the M25, around London. This action led to the conviction of 9 activists who were sentenced to 6 months in prison. Now, at the beginning of this interview, Monbiot attempted to clarify what was the motivation of the protesters. So he pointed out that their actions were a kind of a last-ditch attempt to draw attention to the global environmental disaster that is currently unfolding. He said it was an attempt to make people realize that the danger is real, that a total collapse of ecological systems is possible, and that this could happen much sooner than most people think. In response, Neeson emphasized that she understood very well the concerns of Monbiot, but in her view, the protest action was nevertheless indefensible. The roadblock had caused serious disruption to the daily lives of many people. They had arrived late at work, late at school. Ambulances had been stuck in traffic. A dangerous situation had arisen when some of the motorists tried to force their way through this blockage of the road. As Neeson describes this nuisance, you see that Monbiot takes off his glasses, he rubs his eyes, and he starts to sob. When asked why he was crying, Monbiot replied, "This is the end of everything we dreamed of for our children. Everything could be destroyed. The planet could suddenly go from being habitable to being uninhabitable." Now, the environmental activist who let his tears flow on TV, and the frustrated journalist who tries to explain the angry reactions of motorists, I think this encounter or failed encounter can serve as metonyms for the parallel worlds in which we live today. For Monbiot, there is no doubt that a global environmental disaster will occur sooner or later. And this insight is infinitely more important than the everyday concerns that Neeson worries about. In the world that Neeson tries to evoke, it is the hassle of everyday life that needs to be understood. It's the hassle of everyday life that is being misunderstood, not least by environmental activists like Monbiot. She finds the danger and the disruption of the roadblock that people were exposed to by this roadblock unacceptable. She describes as horrifying what happened to a mother who got into the car that morning to take her son to school and had to deal with an activist in front of her wheels. For mothers like this, Neeson suggests, normal life is not a given. It is a huge task to get ordinary things done. It costs them, it costs us a lot of energy to make life proceed as normal. and as habitual, you could say. A car is not only an environmental polluter, it at the same time operates as a type of care technology. How else do you think that children get to school in the UK, I should add? The bus is unreliable or has been phased out due to budget cuts. Now, this sincere but ultimate fruitless exchange between the environmental activists and the concerned journalists can be seen, I think, for this contemporary condition that I would like to explore in this talk, the post-normal. It is a condition in which, among others, everyday settings like roads become sites of societal conflict. To be sure, in many respects, there is little unusual about the clash between Monbiot and Neeson. Historically, these kind of ideological divergences and ideological disputes are the norm rather than the exception. And the gap between their positions can in part be explained in terms of their respective social position. We can offer a quite standard sort of sociological analysis of their disagreement. Neeson lives in East London and she prides herself on her humble origins, while Monbiot occasionally writes on social media about his pastoral life, his agricultural life, near the prestigious university town of Oxford. Neeson used to be the editor of the Daily Star, a tabloid newspaper, while Monbiot worked for the public broadcaster, the BBC. The conflict between their worldviews, then, where on the one hand we find a belief in the technological economy as the key to a better life, people need to be able to drive to school, and on the other hand, the commitment to nature restoration as a societal program, nature restoration has to be at the center of any politics and governmental intervention. The differences between these ideologies then reflect structural divergences that are inherent in their social position and in their biographies. So I want to emphasize that it's not the conflict between the two different ideologies which is what makes this dialogue and Monbiot's tears so extraordinary. To understand the intensity of ideological conflict today, I think we do well to take a step back from these conflicts themselves and explore the wider environmental situation in which they arise. I would like to propose that this situation can be characterized by the fact that we no longer live in a normal society. So in this talk, I will introduce this concept of the post-normal and the post-normal society and develop the argument that this type of society is marked by a distinct type of latent conflict. And I designate this conflict with the concept of the trial of coexistence. Trials of coexistence. And I'll draw on recent field research that I conducted as part of a project called AI in the Street to investigate such trials of coexistence. And just to give you an advance warning of where my conclusion will go, is that I will argue that it gives rise, these trials of coexistence in post-normal societies, to a very particular problem of solidarity, and that it is this problem of solidarity that I think we have not yet sufficiently sort of worked through, especially actually conceptually. Okay, slides. So several different terms have recently been put forward to capture the techno-environmental predicaments of our era, and certainly cohabitability is among those. So is the notion of the polycrisis. But another term is postnormal. The sociologist Charles Thorpe dates the beginning of the postnormal era to the banking crisis of 2008, which in the West caused the deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s. For Thorpe, this crisis marks the beginning, and it marks the moment at which the expectation that disruption will only be temporary and that everything will sooner or later return to normal, this expectation lost its credibility in the financial crisis. From that moment onwards, everyday life has been plagued by what Thorpe calls chronic uncertainty and what the activist Astra Taylor refers to as ontological insecurity. The material, technical and social amenities that once guaranteed a normal life are increasingly out of reach for a growing number of people. And this expresses itself in the country where I live, Britain, for example, in a lack of affordable housing, a lack of accessible healthcare, a lack of functioning public transport, or even a lack of access to clean water, as incidents of sewage contamination are increasingly common. Now, the term postnormal derives from Thomas Kuhn's philosophy of science, where it was used to characterize the period when existing scientific theories have already lost their legitimacy and they've already lost their credibility, but a new theory has not yet been formulated. And at this point, I was going to make some remarks about Albert Einstein, because it was his relativity theory that for Kuhn was the example of a theory that arose in a post-normal time when Newtonian physics had already been losing its credibility. There was no time to talk about this, but yesterday we found ourselves in a place that Einstein had visited. So I could not mention him now. In the 1990s, two other sociologists of science, Funtewitz and Ravets, took this Kuhnian term of the post-normal and expanded its meaning, using it to denote a historical transformation of science that, in their view, was required in the face of the unprecedented environmental problems that define life in technological societies. So for Funtewitz and Ravets, the complexity and uncertainty and sheer riskiness of contemporary techno-environmental phenomena like nuclear power plant accidents and climate change, these type of problematics reveal the limits of the frameworks of what they call normal science. What is required in their account in the face of techno-environmental predicaments is a transformation of science as usual. And in their view, this transformation of science as usual should take the form of a democratization of research. The research process should no longer be confined to scientists, but it should involve what they call an extended peer community. Science and environmental science in particular should engage all those, and I quote them here, with a stake in an issue and are committed to genuine debate. So having a stake in an issue and being committed to genuine debate is what sort of regulates epistemic relevance and defines the ability to contribute to environmental science. Now, in making this type of argument, Funtewitz and Ravets gave the notion of the post-normal an ontological underpinning, different from Kuhn. So they put center stage these unprecedented techno-environmental challenges that are posed by energy systems, that are posed by other types of techno-scientific inventions like those related to the life sciences and genetic technologies. Now, the second way in which they give the post-normal an ontological underpinning is that they're not just concerned with the transformation of knowledge practices, the creation of knowledge about environmental issues. They're also making the case for a wider transformation of the techno-political apparatus that underlies society's capacity to respond to a hazardous, risky reality. So even though their argument was concerned with science, it was already very much oriented towards building the interventionist capacity of science. However, for reasons that today have been quite difficult to comprehend, I think, they nevertheless limited the import of these techno-ecological challenges to science and politics. Very strikingly, their theory of the postnormal assumed that somehow democracy, and indeed society, would continue to operate more or less as normal. So according to this notion of concept of postnormal science, affected citizens and stakeholders from society would stand at the ready to perform their civic duty and comply with the scripts of knowledge democracy. They would take on this role of affected citizens and participate constructively in a process of collective research. In a way, there was the assumption that society would comply with the scripts or with the theory of deliberative democracy in order to help science deliver on its objectives. Now, today, I think it's no longer possible to make this assumption. Citizens and actors in society cannot be assumed to play ball with science as a matter of course. And when rereading this old paper, or for me, relatively old paper of Funtovich and Ravets, I was reminded of an anecdote about Sigmund Freud. You see, Freud was already in the talk, so, but now I have both early 20th century great figures. Because Freud expressed in a letter his wish that his wife, Martha, would just act normal, so that he could be free to attend to his interestingly not normal patients. It's a kind of division of labor between the support system that should function as normal in order to be able to investigate and take an interest in the abnormal. Now, it can seem that the theory of postnormal science needs citizens and stakeholders to proceed as normal so that postnormal science can work. But today, science as usual is found, it's not only science as usual that is found to be a bad fit for the ontological predicaments of technological societies. So is society as usual, and so is government as usual, and so perhaps is democracy as usual. In a post-normal society, ontological challenges and predicaments have become generalized. They form the background conditions of everyday life. Now, a more technical way of making the same point is to say that something has shifted in the ontological logics of disruption in contemporary technological societies. So in 20th century social and political thought, disruption, and also in cultural thought, disruption has often been framed as a generative event, provocation as a transformative sort of intervention. And it's often been assumed that disruption occurs against the background of a stable environment. You can think here of the pragmatist concept of the problematic situation where trouble arises within an otherwise stable, knowable environment. Today, however, this kind of stable environment can precisely not be assumed. Trouble itself constitutes the background condition of everyday living. As Anat Singh puts it in The Mushroom at the End of the World, we live in a time of endless trouble. In post-normal societies, destabilization is not necessarily followed or does not necessarily initiate a process of re-stabilization. Yes, And so the way in which ontological insecurity becomes ingrained as a background condition of everyday life, the way in which this disruption becomes an environmental condition, I think that's a really critical shift. Also, when we look at the sort of the schema of social and political thought. And yeah, it sort of coincides with this realization that life may perhaps never return to normal. And normal, as Andrew O'Hagan, the novelist, put it in his in The Caledonian Road, normal may be exposed as the name we gave to our negligence. This connects also very much into other arguments around limits to growth, but just leave that aside for now, because instead what I think is a really key aspect of this post-normal condition is that there is very little consensus about it. So as in that failed exchange between Monbiot and Neeson, the post-normal situation is marked by deep ideological conflict. You could even say that it is marked by a splitting of reality, a polarization between two irreconcilable ideological positions. While some continue to invest in solutionism, others seek to come to terms with the coming crisis. And as I already said, this type of conflict between sort of technological progressivism and environmental crisis thinking, this ideological opposition is one of which there is a very long historical sort of prehistory that it really takes us back to also debates in 19th century Europe around industrialization. But what I think is a crucial difference that is important for us to come to terms with is that this splitting of the world does not only express itself in discourse, in the positions that people take in debates, for instance, it also expresses itself in the very way that technological environments are being organized and reorganized today. So that's what I now would like to focus on. So I will draw on a project AI in the Street, which was a collaborative research project that I conducted with colleagues from the arts, science technology studies, and also philosophy. I will not say more about the project, but will just focus on one street where I've spent quite a bit of time these last years, the Holyhead Road in Coventry. And I think here we can see how this splitting of the world manifests within an everyday setting like the street. So the Holyhead Road is a mixed-use road. It's a residential road, many people live there, but it's also a commuter road. It's the road to Birmingham from Coventry, which is a post-industrial city in the sort of in the middle of England, the West Midlands. The Holyhead Road, however, is also an automated vehicle test road, as it is part of the Midlands Future Mobility Initiative, which is a regional testbed for automated vehicle trialling. As part of this mobility testbed, the Holyhead Road has been equipped with various monitoring, communication devices, as well as analytic devices, including AI-enabled cameras, Wi-Fi routers, smart traffic lights. That is to say that the Holyhead Road, as part of this testbed initiative, has been transformed into a site of data extraction, as the monitoring and communication devices that have been installed in the street feed into an API, an application programming interface, which, according to the testbed website, provides commercial third parties access to what they term scene-specific assets, infrastructures, and road information. And they note this data infrastructure that has been embedded in the street will enable these third-party developers to selectively monetize, license, and share their data sets with other users. Now, this infrastructure is very much under development, and indeed it's not certain how much of this is currently functional in the Holyhead Road, but definitely we have mapped out these devices as they can be found in the street, and in terms of the technical substratum, it's very much present in the street. The Holyhead Road also has been modeled in a digital twin in an automotive test center, and sort of some of the data capture that goes on in that road also feeds into this simulator. Now, what interests me is that as part of this kind of preparing of the street for these kind of digital interventions, both in terms of preparing the street for technology testing, but also preparing the street for automation itself, that these interventions produce what you can think of as a kind of a doubling of reality. On the one hand, we can walk in the Holyhead Road, we meet people there, we visit the Holyhead Road, and at the same time, it has been structured and is being organized as a kind of techno-scientific environment, an environment available for techno-scientific modeling and evaluation. And a key feature of this doubling of the environment, however, is that it's not really observable from the standpoint of the street. So when we chat with people that we encounter in Holyhead Road, or during workshops that we've organized with neighborhoods and residents of Spon End, which is the neighboring neighborhood, people will indicate that this test bed and all this monitoring and testing doesn't really have anything to do with them. So one participant says, these cameras in the last lamppost, they do not communicate with us. They are above our heads, literally. They communicate with elsewhere. These boxes, and he's referring to roadside units, which are less transparent. I don't quite understand what goes on in them, but that also have been installed in the street as part of the test bed. These boxes are not giving anything. They are just extracting. They seem designed to not draw attention to themselves. So this infrastructural doubling of the environment is something that is inaccessible from the street, which I think is very important to this issue of how to coexist with technology, because how do you coexist with something that has its back turned to the street and is indeed organized for audiences and service providers that are not present in the street. A second key feature of this doubling of the setting in the test in a test street like the Holyhead Road is that it gives rise to two planes of reality that are not symmetrical. So we should not understand these two planes of reality in the Holyhead Road as being somehow equal in status. They have a very different ontological status. So the road as a living environment, ontologically speaking, precedes the innovation environment or the test environment. The street was there first, while the road as a synthetic environment only came about as a result of the re-equipment of the setting. So while the test bed exists in the street, the test bed is not off the street. There's not a relationship of belonging to the street. Well, when we understand the street as a living environment, that relation of belonging to the street, of being off the street, is a defining relation. So I think this sort of difference or this asymmetry in how entities in the street relate to it through embodied experience, and the way in which entities relate to the street through what you could call infrastructures of scientific abstraction. These are two very different ways of relating to the street, and the difference between that relation, I think, is really key to grasping what is the challenge of cohabitability in technological environments like the street. And the term that I currently use to try and think that through, that asymmetry, that parallelism that isn't quite a parallel, is this notion of the trial of coexistence. So to go quick, we could say that the infrastructural environment of the testbed and the Holyhead Road as a space of everyday life refer to two contending modes of existence. So they activate, one could say, two contending modes of existence, which we, by shorthand, could refer to as innovation and living, even though we can question those terms. These two modes of existence in an environment like the Holyhead Road are not only mutually withdrawn from each other, they are also incompatible, or perhaps even in the long term, they have to be understood as mutually exclusive. One of them is going to have to give way sooner or later. So the infrastructural environment of the testbed does not only prepare the Holyhead Road for automated systems. This testbed also transforms the background conditions of everyday life in the street. And they do so in ways that threaten the conditions of existence of some entities in the street. For example, as a kind of an index of this kind of transformation of the street in the wake of the testbed, there have been various tree fellings. Trees have been cut down in order to enable a widening of the roads around the Holyhead Road. And this occurred shortly after the testbed was launched. So here you see a protest that followed the felling of those trees around Holyhead Road. Now, this tree felling was brought up time and again in discussions we had about the impact of the testbed. Once we had sort of, communicated the presence of the testbed to project participants. In one workshop, someone sort of made this effort to articulate what exactly constitute this drama of the felling, the cutting of trees in and close to the Holyhead Road. And this was part of an exercise in which we created diagrams of the Holyhead Road and the entities that cohabit there in an attempt to get to these kind of challenges of coexistence. Now, they wrote, so someone put the trees on the map and said, assumed the standpoint of one of the trees and said, I was here when Turner painted the city of Coventry from this road. So this is the painting by Coventry, who in the early 19th century painted the vision of Coventry, which was later to become an industrial city. And you can still see this church tower from the point where now the testbed sits. This tree then says, I lost my family of trees and mushrooms, spiders, and other entities as they cut the forest up for cars and flight machines. So there is a kind of a sense that can be brought out through these kind of, these kind of participatory types of exploration of the street, where all manner of entities whose conditions of existence are no longer in place in the street can nevertheless be brought out. And I think this is where this notion of a trial of coexistence can really help us understand what is the drama of, in this case, automated vehicle testing in an everyday environment like the street. Because it helps to grasp that even if interventions can seem quite small, like installing some monitoring equipment on a traffic light, that nevertheless the contest and the conflict that takes place in these gestures is no less than a contest between worlds. So the infrastructural conditions that are put in place as part of the testbed are made in order to secure the future of the car system. And this endeavor of securing the future of the car system is in direct conflict with conditions of existence of a set of different entities in the street. Now that includes the tree that I just invoked, but it also includes this flower, a sow thistle. So this plant is an ingredient for soup, and as we walk the street, I was told that residents forage for these flowers along the Holyhead Road. However, the levels of pollution and car pollution in the street are currently such that it would be toxic to put these flowers in soup. Now, like the conflict between Monbiot and Neeson, these type of dramas, the trials of coexistence, are historically a deeply common occurrence. So the entire history of the invention of the automotive system is littered with trials of coexistence. And it is here that the connection with normality and the post-normal is so crucial, because all along the development of automotive infrastructures from the early 20th century onward, the notion of acceptable costs, what are the costs that are acceptable of reaping the benefits of automotive technology, has been justified in terms of a normal life. So the car system secures a normal life for society, for a population. And so there's something in the logic of the trial of consistence, the trial of existence as we encounter them today, where those calculations of normality no longer obtain. And I think that is where we need to get, find the concepts to be able to express that breakdown of that calculation of normality. I'm looking at my clock and thinking, do I have another 10 minutes or so? That's great. That makes me happy. Yes. So I won't say more about this, except that filmmaking was really important in making the connection between tree cutting and the sort of wider environmental challenge that connect with automated vehicle testing, or that arise from automated vehicle testing. Because, of course, automated vehicles are introduced into Coventry as, you know, they are electric, they are sustainable, they are part of the phasing out of carbon emissions. And so it was a very challenging and uphill, kind of an uphill battle to demonstrate that this cost, the calculation of normality, actually did not obtain for the testbed. But problems of solidarity, or the problem of solidarity as it arises in this context. Now, to think through these kind of trials or latent environmental conflicts that sort of unfold in some ways on the infrastructural infrastructural layer in everyday technological environments. I find this notion of the notion that there's a shift in the framing of existence and of existentialism, a helpful starting point. So this is Nikolai Schutz. Some of you may know his work, who wrote a paper a few years ago about the new existentialism. Something he developed further in a short book with Bruno Latour on the ecological class. And he makes the argument that what we're seeing today is a kind of a shift in what are the defining questions and indeed logics that used to be captured under this label of existentialism. So he notes, or he puts it in this way, he says, the defining questions of existence used to be framed in terms of the meaning of life, the meaning of existence. But within a context of environmental crisis, the question of existence is no longer one that is focused primarily on the apprehension of the world. It revolves around the issue of what beings allow other beings to exist. Something that we can also define as interdependence. Now, in some sense, I very much disagree with Schutz in that I think that scientific abstraction, as I've introduced it here, is an absolutely key ingredient in the trials of coexistence that we are confronting today, meaning that to disregard the apprehension of the world as no longer that relevant in our existential predicament seems to me, to lead away from to sort of risk a bracketing of the epistemic logic of trials of existence. But this shift, this centering of interdependence as the defining sort of logic and challenge of existence, and that this is now a notion that is centered in political thought. I think that's a really quite momentous event. Not least because in feminist scholarship, the notion of interdependence has been centered very consistently through the social studies of technology and into feminist, eco-feminist work. So it's very interesting when political theorists start taking up feminist vocabulary. And I want to just draw attention to one particular philosopher in that regard, Mary Midgley, who has theorized interdependence also in relation to Gaia and the politics of existence under conditions of environmental crisis. And she makes the point that there's something like one of the defining challenges of the interdependence, both as a reality and a concept, is that on the one hand, it has always been a defining condition of existence. So all of human life has always depended on beings that allow other beings to exist. While at the same time, the forgetting of interdependence is this event that occurs time and again in particular the Western philosophical tradition, which then requires intervention to be recovered. And this, in fact, is you could think that that's what Schutz and Latour were also doing in this work of sort of remembering interdependence. And it's a very particular tradition in which remembering interdependence takes effort, Yeah, so that is, I think, where we need to really insist that, for instance, also relations of coexistence, even though they might seem to belong to the order of the mundane, are nevertheless the crux of the matter. And what is, I think, like helpful in a focus on these trials of coexistence is that they make it clear that interdependence is, as a challenge, is always a challenge in the plural. So it's never a singular human that is challenged when it comes to how do we secure interdependence. So in trials of existence, ontological insecurity is a shared condition. So even though it's very asymmetrical, you know, the relations, like different entities, for instance, in the environment of the Holyhead Road, you know, the relative security or insecurity of existence is distributed very unequally between entities on the Holyhead Road. But it's nevertheless a shared condition, and it is a conflictual condition. So it's shared and conflictual. And I think this is what also needs to take center stage in how we think through the condition of the post-normal. So in a post-normal society, social material conditions of coexistence have become inherently conflictual, inherently contested. The conditions of existence of some entities stand in direct contradiction with the conditions of existence of other entities, and this to the point that they put the world at stake. The trial of coexistence is one that where both are and are not in it together. It is not a symmetrical trial, it's defined by asymmetry. Those entities that owe their existence to the apparatus of scientific abstraction operate in a different layer of reality from those entities whose very endurance is threatened by the social material sort of fallout of the operationalization of scientific abstraction into technological computational infrastructures in the street. So that also means that in a post-normal society it's no longer possible to conceive of interdependence as a human relationship. It extends dependence, and it extends into the dependence of all living entities on environmental conditions, which is to say that interdependence becomes problematic. It is not clear what forms of agency can address or resolve the situation of trials of coexistence. And it is not clear what concepts of solidarity can sort of cross the divide or bridge the divide between these different entities whose existence is mutually threatened. Now, this can get quite complex, so I just want to note like two main points in relation to these problems of solidarity. So the first is that there are, within technological environments like the Holyhead Road, many forms and ideas, concepts of solidarity are in operation, are active, are being deployed in the setting. So there is the vibrant solidarity that we can find in living environments, like, and which often gets referred to as a kind of more than human sociality. So here, solidarity is always already happening. You know, the thistle is growing and is a source of at least talk of making soup, if not the actual making of soup. At the same time, there is an abstract solidarity that is scripted and written into the testbed, where the testbed is there to provide jobs for the region. It's there to turn the city into an inclusive champion of sustainable mobility. So notions of solidarity are continuously mobilized by many, if not all, of the actors that are active in this setting. It's not that solidarity, like interdependence, is being forgotten about. But these modes of solidarity, as they are practiced and evoked in an environment like the Holyhead Road, are also mutually incompatible. So, of course, more than human solidarity is always already happening in the street, and interdependence is always already happening in the street. But this type of more than human sociality is at the same time continuously and quite fundamentally under threat in a busy commuter road like the Holyhead Road. In this particular trial of coexistence, more than human assemblies include entities that put the very endurance of more than human ecologies at risk. And I think there's a challenge there around the notion of ecology, which tends to project an assumption of the possibility of conviviality, of cohabitation, which in many technological environments precisely does not obtain. Now, I really believe then that this more than human solidarity or environmental modes of solidarity that are adequate to our current globalized trial of existence, that these concepts of solidarity are not already available. So we may be able to say more than human solidarity, or we may be able to say the word cohabitability, but I don't think that we actually have the concept available to us or are able to formulate the concept that articulates how solidarity is possible across these divides between the sites and communities of everyday living and the modes of post-industrial innovation. And I think here it is really important that we also think historically and look to other exemplars, like, for instance, the work by Jacques Donzelot, who wrote this book, The Invention of the Social, which is a history of 19th century France and the endless social conflicts and political disputes that took place in order to settle the fight over what solidarity could mean and had to mean in an industrial society that was emerging also in the wake of the French Revolution. So what in Donzelot is very clear, and I think also very helpful, is that the formulation of a solidarity principle that was adequate to the trials of coexistence that marked industrial society in France at the time, this took an incredible sort of political energy and an incredible mobilization. So there was nothing straightforward about the invention, for instance, of the notion of collective risk, which enabled finally to a step outside of paternalistic conceptions of how the population could be protected from the negative consequences of industrialization. And crucially, this work of definition, even though the work of definition focused on specific concepts, so how do we define solidarity, how do we define collective risk, how do we define welfare, what was crucially at stake in all that definitional work was the relation between state, economy, and society. So if you're a bit megalomaniac, which as you may have deduced from this talk, I sometimes have a tendency to. Our challenge in terms of how we formulate the problem of solidarity now includes relations between technology, economy, society, and environment. And I think that is what I would really like to emphasize in my conclusion, that even though the conceptual repertoire of more than human sociality is available to us, and it is of critical importance, I do not want to trivialize or minimize the accomplishment of that vocabulary, I think that currently, today, it is not doing the job of compelling us, forcing us into this problematic of defining relations between state, economy, society, and nature. And it's for that reason that I want to remind all of us that it took 100 years of struggle between liberals, conservatives, socialists, and communists in France before they arrived at a viable settlement of the arrangements for collective risk called the welfare state. And I think we're probably somewhere in the middle of that trajectory, where it is still clear that there is no ready-made vocabulary available to us to define the problem of solidarity, let alone the arrangements of collective risk that can make it viable. So I think it's better if we bring this to a close. And I think I've mentioned the main 2 points in a conclusion throughout my comments. So I can leave them there for those who are interested in reading them. Thank you.